In this lesson, we're going to talk about asset disposal and decommissioning. Now, an organization is going to expand and modernize its technology stack over time, and there's going to be a significant volume of data, software, hardware, and services that are accumulated, and eventually they're going to outlive their usefulness and purpose. However, we can't simply throw away these assets in the trash. Instead, we need to have a proper procedure in place to ensure that data security, regulatory compliance, and efficient use of resources is occurring. To help us with this, the National Institute of Standards and Technology created a document known as the Special Publication 800-88, which is commonly referred to as the Guidelines for Media Sanitization. Now, these guidelines provide our organizations with guidance on how to conduct sanitization, destruction, and certification for our asset disposal and decommissioning processes. Now, first, we have sanitization. Sanitization refers to the thorough process of making data inaccessible and irretrievable from a storage medium using traditional forensic techniques. Now, whether the data is stored on a hard drive, solid-state device, memory card, or other type of storage device, sanitization is going to be used to ensure that it completely is removed so that it is impervious to recovery, even with some advanced forensic techniques. Common methods employed in sanitization include overwriting your data multiple times, degaussing the storage medium, or employing encryption techniques. Our primary objective with sanitization is to protect sensitive information from unauthorized access, especially when disposing of or repurposing a storage device. Now, one of our sanitization techniques that we commonly use is to overwrite data multiple times. Overwriting data multiple times involves replacing the existing data on a storage device with a random series of information to ensure that the original data is going to be obscured if anybody tries to recover it using forensic techniques. Now, this overwriting process is often repeated several times to reduce any chance of the original data being recovered. Most commonly, overwriting processes are going to use a single pass, 7 passes, or 35 passes, depending on the classification level of the data that you're trying to sanitize, with higher classification levels needing more passes during that overwriting process. Now, the logic behind this method is that each overwrite is going to make it increasingly more difficult for potential adversaries to retrieve any meaningful data using forensic tools or techniques. By employing this technique, we're not only ensuring the confidentiality of our stored data, but we're also minimizing the risks associated with data breaches or unauthorized access, especially during device disposal or repurposing. Now, another sanitization technique we have is known as degaussing. Now, degaussing involves using a single machine called a degausser to produce a strong magnetic field that can disrupt the magnetic domains on a storage device like a hard disk drive or a tape backup. This degaussing process renders the data on the device unreadable and irretrievable. Unlike overwriting, though, which might leave a small possibility of data recovery, degaussing will completely erase the magnetic properties of the storage medium to ensure that the data is permanently destroyed. However, it's also important to note that once a device has been degaussed, it can no longer be used for storage because its fundamental ability to store data has now been eliminated. This method is especially valuable when devices are set to be discarded or recycled to ensure that no data remnants of sensitive information remains on that discarded storage device. Now, secure erase is our third method. And secure erase is another sanitization technique that used to be very popular, and it was a precursor to the newer cryptographic erase technique that you're going to learn about. Now, with secure erase, we are aiming to completely delete data from a storage device while ensuring that it cannot be recovered using traditional recovery tools or methods. This method is typically going to be implemented at the firmware level of a storage device, like a solid-state device or a hard disk drive. When the secure erase command is issued, the storage device's built-in erasure routine is going to be activated, and it's going to purge all the data blocks to make the data irretrievable from that device. Over time, some flaws were found in the secure erase technique, and a newer, more secure technique known as cryptographic erase, or CE, was introduced to replace the secure erase technique in most of our modern storage devices. Now, cryptographic erase is going to leverage encryption technologies as its primary mechanism for doing data sanitization. Now, when data is initially stored on a given device, it's going to be encrypted using cryptographic keys. During the cryptographic erasure process, instead of trying to erase the actual data on the device, we simply are going to deliberately destroy or delete the encryption keys themselves. Because without these keys, the data remains on the device, but it's rendered unreadable. So in practical terms, it's now considered irretrievable. Now, one of the significant advantages of using cryptographic erase over traditional erasure methods is speed. Because with cryptographic erase, we're only having to delete the encryption keys and not all of the data on a 1 or 2 or 10 terabyte hard disk drive. This makes the entire sanitization process really quick to perform, and it can be done in less than about 30 to 60 seconds when you're doing a cryptographic erasure. Also, because our data remains encrypted and indecipherable without that decryption key, the storage device can then be repurposed or resold without there being the risk of data leakage. Next, let's talk about destruction. Now, while sanitization is trying to make data unrecoverable, Destruction goes a step further by ensuring that the physical device itself is beyond recovery or reuse. The NIST guidelines recommend methods like shredding, pulverizing, melting, or incinerating storage media as possible forms of destruction. For instance, I used to work at the National Security Agency, and whenever we decommissioned our old top-secret workstations, we had to remove the hard drives from those machines and then have them physically shredded to prevent anyone from accessing our nation's top-secret information. So, if you're working in a high-security environment that includes secret or top-secret data, usually data sanitization will not be considered secure enough for this kind of high-security environment, and instead, we're going to use a data destruction technique like shredding, pulverizing, melting, or incinerating the storage device that is going to be used instead, depending on the type of media and the nature of data that it once held. Now, once the data has been sanitized or the storage device has been destroyed, we want to document that the asset disposal or destruction has been completed by following a certification process. According to the NIST standards, certification is an act of proof that the data or hardware has been securely disposed of. The certification can be especially important for organizations who must comply with strict regulatory controls or those organizations that handle particularly sensitive data, such as top-secret government data, financial information, or health records contained on your systems. With certification, we are not merely focused on the sanitization or destruction of the data, but we also want to ensure that we can provide evidence that our organization is taking its data security posture very seriously by creating an audit log of the sanitization, disposal, or destruction process for a given data set. Now, when it comes to data, every piece of data has what's known as a life cycle, and that life cycle begins when the data is first created, and it ends when the data is being disposed of or destroyed. For this reason, it's important to consider your data retention requirements when you're developing your asset disposal and destruction policies. Now, data retention isn't about hoarding every piece of data indefinitely, but instead, we are focused on strategically deciding on what to keep and for how long. The data lifecycle is going to encompass stages from data creation, data processing, data archiving, and the eventual data destruction. But why should we retain data in the first place? Why not just delete everything when you no longer need to use it? Well, there's several reasons that might require us to retain data. Regulatory requirements, for example, might mandate that certain types of data, like financial transactions or medical records, be preserved for a specific period of time. Additionally, retained data could be valuable if your organization needs to be able to conduct historical analysis, trend prediction, or even to resolve some disputes. However, retaining everything is simply not feasible, nor is it advisable. Storing vast amounts of data comes with a cost in terms of tangible things like server costs and storage costs, as well as intangible costs like increasing the complexity of your data and your system management. Additionally, the more data that your organization retains, the larger a target your data is going to become for a cyber threat actor. Personally, I like to think about this mantra when I'm developing my data retention policies within my organizations. The more you store, the more you must secure. So why don't we just retain everything? Well, even though storage costs have been reduced over the years, it's still a pretty significant expense when you try to keep everything, especially for larger organizations who store petabytes of data. Moreover, storing data indefinitely can lead to clutter that makes data retrieval and analysis much more cumbersome and time-consuming. Another often overlooked aspect is data protection. Every piece of data, no matter how trivial, needs to be protected from potential data breaches. The more data you have, the more expansive your security measures are going to need to be, and this in turn translates into higher costs and the need to make additional resource allocations. So remember, asset disposal and decommissioning is an important process that must be considered so your assets can be properly handled throughout their entire lifecycle, especially during retirement and disposal. By following standardized procedures like the guidelines presented by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, we can ensure that we're not just in compliance, but we're also helping to increase our peace of mind. Our end goal here is clear. Dispose of assets securely, retain data judiciously, and ensure the integrity and reputation of our organizations remain untarnished.